I think we need to go back to what kind of world did God design us to live in? And it's not a world where we're being cared for by robots. I know that much. It's a world where we're being cared for by a large, loving, multi generational family.
Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Jeremy Pryor podcast, where I get to hang out once a week with one or more of my kiddos. And where's everybody today, Sid? Seems like our family's like dispersed.
Yeah, they're just doing their own things now. What's up with that?
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming and hanging out with me. This is I got some stuff for us to chat about, and excited to do that. We're coming up against a big graduation weekend. A lot of what's going on right now is we're getting ready for Elisa's graduation party. She's turned 18, and now she's having an awesome party, so it's gonna be fun. And we got a big Shabbat dinner tonight we get to do. Before we dive into all that, so I want to talk to you. There's two topics I have. So we're going to talk about demographics, which is a huge favorite topic of mine. And I saw a video where this was being framed in a really helpful way. And I was like, let's talk about that. And so I'll play some clips for you from that conversation between a group of demographers. And then there was a conversation around why the royal family matters, which is another sort of recent pet topic of mine that I want to explore with you. So we're going to start with demography. And this is a really critical topic for us to talk through because our children and grandchildren are going to grow up in a fundamentally different world than we have grown up in. Demography is destiny. We already know, exactly how many, for example, we know exactly how many 60-year-olds are going to be alive in 2083, right? So you can know so much about the future if you study demography. And a lot of people have the most accurate predictions of far into the future, 40, 50, 60 years, have been by demographers because, again, they know trends that are inevitable because you can't make more, 60-year-olds anymore in that year because they're already children today, they're babies. So I think for a lot of people, it's hard to get their head around how powerful demographics are at predicting the future. And so I like to listen to demographers and try to understand because I care a lot about the world that my grandchildren are going to grow up in. And I think a big responsibility on us as fathers and as parents is to really be thoughtful about the kind of world our kids are gonna grow up in and how to help shape that and how to really understand some of these trends. So we're going to start with this conversation between these different demographers.
It's a little bit about the report. So the essence of the report is what I call the demographic trilemma, which is something that I wrote about in my most recent book, Tomorrow's People. The idea of the trilemma is you can have two, but not all three, of the following things. You can have small families, you can have economic dynamism, and you can have low immigration, ethnic continuity, if you like. You can have two, but not three of those things. There is a trade-off between them. And I think we are much better off as a society and politically if we understand those trade-offs.
So this is really interesting framing. He's saying, when you think about the future, if you want to have a vibrant economy, you have to pick between these three things. You can only have two, but you can't have all three, right? So he said small families. So you can choose to have small families. You can choose to have lower. I think he mentioned you can have just a worse economy, or you can have a ton of immigration, but you can't have all three. So because if you don't, the demography is going to take over. If you have a shrinking population, you're going to have an economic collapse. So you have to come up with, there's only two ways to stop a population from shrinking. One is to have larger families, and the other is to have a ton of immigration. And there's problems, of course, with both of those elements that can be created in society, can create an unstable situation for a culture. But you can't have a shrinking number of people. This is something that every economist understands. and not see like a large scale economic collapse. And it's much worse than people think in terms of the level of the collapse, because it's a just like population growth can be an exponential curve up, population decline is an exponential curve down. So what you have to picture, I think one of the things that's helpful to picture is imagine if on your street the housing prices went down so low that you couldn't sell a house for $1. That happened in Detroit. People can't imagine that happening. That's going to happen to probably 100 cities around the world in the next 50 years. You won't be able to sell houses at all because their value will be less than zero, because no one wants to live there. They cost a lot of money to maintain. And you see this happening in Italy. There's a lot of places where this is already starting, but it's gonna exponentially get worse over time. So that the kinds of collapse that creates economically to all the businesses in those cities, and then it gets worse and worse and worse as the population declines. So you can stop that by having enormous amounts of immigration to try to make up the difference and drive up the demand for goods, services, housing, businesses, or you can have larger families, but you can't have both. So I'll let him finish his thought here.
The examples I give of those trade-offs are three countries. In Japan, they are unashamed about talking about ethnic continuity. The term itself is something problematic for people in Europe. But in Japan, in Korea, much of East Asia and other parts of the world, they are happy to say we have a preference for ethnic continuity, a continuity of the people in this country, and a limited immigration. And that's what Japan has chosen. It has very low immigration levels, not zero, but low, a low level of foreign population as a share of the total. At the same time, Japan has been a world leader in small family size. It's had below replacement fertility, fewer than 2.1 children per woman, and actually well below that for most of the last 50 years. The result is, having chosen small families and having chosen ethnic continuity, Japan cannot have a dynamic economy. Its economy, which was once the poster child of the developing world, has had much slower growth in the last 35 years than it had in the previous 35 years. It has a huge debt to GDP ratio because its government has too few workers and too many older people needing care and needing pensions. And its prime minister has talked about civilizational collapse. So it chooses those two, and it suffers on the third dimension.
So, oof. Does that make sense? I think it's a really good example. We'll let him use one more example here.
UK, by contrast, wishes to keep the lights on. It wishes to keep its economy ticking over, not that successfully, but where there are labour shortages, it responds to those labour shortages and feels we need workers to undertake those tasks. And at the same time, although fertility has not been as low as in Japan, Britain has also had 50 years, 2 generations of below replacement fertility rate. And the result is that Britain cannot have, for want of a better term, ethnic continuity. Britain needs, if it wants those two things, if it wants small families and a buoyant economy, it needs to have mass immigration. And those who complain about mass immigration, I think, would be better to understand why it is that despite the promises of government, nevertheless, immigration has been so high. The only example in the developed world which has chosen the third point on the axis is Israel. In Israel, women have around 3 children each. That's a whole child plus more than any OECD country. Israel now, although of course it's built on Jewish immigration, it now has lower immigration than the OECD average, and yet it can keep its economy ticking over. It's had a very successful economy, largely because it has a fresh inflow of workers much larger than those leaving the labour force. So that's been Israel's choice. The question really then was, what are the trade-offs like? If we wanted to stop immigration in the UK, say, and we wanted to keep the family sizes as small as they are, just how bad would the dependency ratio go? And if, on the other hand, we wanted to say, we'll keep having immigration to keep the dependency ratio level without a fertility rate increase, just how high does immigration have to go? And if we want to do neither of those things, how much does our fertility need to increase? And that's where I work with Philip, who has helped model this and can give us the answers to those questions.
Okay. Oof. All right. So I think this is such an important framing, the trilemma, right? You have to pick. And so you gave an example of countries that have picked each of those. So you have the Japanese, who, if you have to pick small families, a vibrant economy, or mass immigration, they picked small families and the collapse, the weaker economy to stop the immigration in order to create a society where there's a lot of ethnic continuity. That's their, that's the trade-off. Thomas Sowell famously said that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And one of the problems with the way that modern politics works is they always want to hide the trade-offs because it sounds a lot better if a politician can pretend like you can have everything. You can't have everything. These demographers, I think, are telling people the truth. That there's a huge cost to small families. And so you have in the UK, they've decided, okay, in order to make sure that we don't have a collapsing economy, we want to maintain, or we don't know how to recover from the small family size. So we're going to invite mass immigration in order to stop the economic collapse that'll happen from population decline. And so that's one other trade off that is being chosen, and oftentimes it's not being honestly presented to the public. And then, of course, you have the Israel example, which is by far my favorite. Like, why not deal with the family problem? This has been this is to me the obvious choice, although it's incredibly difficult for I think any kind of secular culture to figure out how to deal with the small family size. There's never been a secular culture that really has successfully figured this out because it really does require a certain kind of faith and a certain kind of belief system. I think to make sense of why you would have a larger families, not just one-off larger family, 'cause that can happen anywhere, but a whole culture of larger families. Like that is not something that is possible that I know of outside of really faith commitment. If you have affluent societies, they all tend to have small families. And so this is and we're gonna the next clip I'm gonna play for you is diving into the example of Israel, because I think that this is where we really need to spend time focusing. Israel is the only country that is developed that has an above replacement rate, fertility rate. No other Western country has been able to do this. Hungary has really tried through public policies, but they're not able to get above replacement rate yet. They've gone all the way to essentially giving zero income tax to women who have more than 4 children as a policy, and it's helped increase the percentage by like 0.1, 0.2%. But man, we need a lot more in order to get above replacement. So yeah, this is a really interesting trilemma. I'm curious, Sydney. Yeah, what does that stir up for you? And any thoughts about this framing?
That's so interesting. I love when people are able to take so much data and then boil it all down to something that's easy to comprehend, like the trilemma, these three things. So that makes it a lot easier for me to understand, having not studied any of this stuff. But that it definitely makes a lot of sense because if you're not birthing enough people, then it would make sense to invite a lot of people from other countries instead. Um, and there is a way I feel like you can go overboard with that because then that would mean um, that would do the opposite of what Japan is trying to do, like keep their ethnicity pure or whatever. Um, as an American, I don't care that much about that because our culture is just such a boiling pot and a melting pot, and I kind of like that about our culture. But yeah, if you were a culture like Japan, you would have to care a lot about having children if you do want to carry on your bloodline and keep your ethnicity pure, keep your gene pool pure. So it is interesting that they just choose to um, prioritize other things, even though that has been a tradition for so long for them to be so isolated and stay within their own communities. So it is interesting that we can see now the data, the results of them living that way. And this guy is really doing a good job of articulating it. He's very articulate, and I appreciate it. But yeah, the Israel solution is seems so great. I don't know. I feel like that those, all of those values seem so rich and so um just long term and really smart. And I just feel like that is in America, I feel like we're going to see so many people who are immigrating from countries that value big family. They're going to start taking over because this is just this is where their values lie. And those people don't die out. They stay around. That's what we've seen. They are above the replacement rate. So they're just going to keep multiplying. Whereas the people that are so individually focused, they're not gonna be replacing themselves and they're gonna end up dying out. So unless something happens, I really hope they don't die out. But I watched a really interesting video about Korea, um, where someone was like going around and asking Koreans what they thought about the birth rate crisis, and it was a very interesting, very informative video because you can just see where their priorities lie. They're like, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that on the news, but that doesn't really seem like a huge concern." 'Cause they're so concerned about making money, and they're like, "I couldn't even afford a kid anyway, so what's the point?"
Right.
And it's like, you can see where their values lie. The combination of not wanting to take in new immigrants, their discrimination towards people outside, their xenophobia, the combination of that with their unwillingness to reproduce themselves, it's just gonna breed disaster. So, yeah, that's really good data to hear about.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to be watching Japan and Korea to face the trade-offs because you're gonna see such an economic. I mean, you've seen Japan, they were just booming. I remember in the '80s, I took Japanese because everyone said that, um, at the time, I was like, "Oh, I might wanna get involved in business. What's the best language to learn if you wanna be in business?" Well, Japan was their economy was growing so fast
Yeah.
that I was like, I think that if I want a competitive advantage in business, then I need to learn Japanese. So I spent 3 years trying to study Japanese in high school, and then as soon as I completed high school, their economy started to collapse, and a lot of it was due to demographic issues, and now they're in a much worse position. A lot of it's being propped up through debt and things, but it's gonna get a lot worse because they have an inverted pyramid, right? So you wanna have an economy where there's a lot more people coming into the economy at the bottom that, to help pay for all the services for older people. But in Japan, they sell more adult diapers than baby diapers, and in Korea, it takes 100 Koreans to make 3 great grandchildren at their current demographic rate, which is 0.08 per woman, and you need at least 2.1 to just to replace the population. So 0.08. I mean, that is a cliff. If you start playing that out over 4, 5, 6 generations, the level of collapse is almost difficult to comprehend in terms of how few people are going to be in Korea in 100 years at that rate. So so we do need to really be paying attention to Israel. Like we got to zero in on Israel because most people, when they look at this trade off, they'll probably say, well, okay, we need a vibrant economy. And so how do we do this? And if we let in just unchecked immigration, then it's going to disrupt society at an exponential rate as well. Like we need to have immigration, but it needs to be checked. It needs to be controlled, and it needs to be orderly and thoughtful. And if you can't do that because you have a population that's collapsing, then you're going to lose so many elements of your society anyway. So really, the only part of this trade off that makes sense is to increase family size. So I'll play the next part of their discussion when they start to get more detailed into Israel.
So elderly care, childcare, it's not fungible. It matters who does it or what does it. And if we learn anything from COVID, is that isolation is absolutely terrible for.
So they're going to start this discussion by kind of talking through some of the implications of population collapse. I think they're really helpful before they begin to kind of zero in on the Israel example.
Human psychology.
Mhm.
And the idea that somebody in their 80s receiving care from a robot, it will be equivalent to receiving care from your own child or grandchild. I mean, it's just for the birds. Is that.
So a lot of people are saying, well, we don't have to worry about population collapse. We'll just have robots. And then they're talking about, yeah, talk about a dystopian nightmare. Having old people cared for by robots, not knowing another human.
The same with childcare. For a baby of one, mum is not equivalent to a daycare worker. Those two things just aren't the same. And I think the problem with this essentially economic issue is that the answers are not purely economic. This isn't about who should supply our energy, where do we get the best source of energy in the future. This is about making babies. And that's not something that economists can just sit there. So if you pull this lever, it really is. It's a cultural, a psychological issue. And this is why I come back to this idea that if it no longer becomes the norm to have children, then we are in deep trouble, because there's a big difference between, I had my first child at 25. There's a big difference between bringing a child into the world at 25 when all your friends are doing it, when there's a baby group every day, when there's plenty of support, when your own parents are young enough to help you look after your child, when everybody in your family is doing the same thing, when you've still got grandparents alive yourself, to bringing a child into the world in your 30s when you know nobody else but the child. There's no other children in the playground. There isn't even actually any childcare anymore because there's no demand for it. But those are two very, very different prospects. And my fear is that unless we reverse this decline rapidly, it will become so culturally unusual to have a child that people will just stop doing it altogether. And I think,
So one of the things that she's pointing out that has been demonstrated over and over again is that this problem doesn't just sort of stop at a certain rate; it continues to go down. So if you have as soon as you go below replacement rate, it's not like you just stay there. It's not like we just stay at, like, let's say we're at 1.8, or 1.6, somewhere around. That's 1.7. That's about where the U.S. is at. You don't stay at 1.7 because what starts to happen is it becomes a little bit less normal to have children, and so people stop. So the culture of childlessness starts to become more common, and so the population rate goes down even more, and then you feel unusual for having children, and so there's all the examples and models you're seeing, and so it just continues to go down, continues to go down, continues to go down. So you will still have exponential collapse of the population if you just stayed at like 1.5 or zero point zero 0.08 like the South Koreans. But what she says is the demographers have discovered that it doesn't stop there. It continues to collapse even more as the culture becomes more and more used to the idea of just not having children.
what's also really interesting in this paper is that even if we did solve this problem now, even if we did somehow enable women to have the number of children that they say they want, because women do actually say they want 2 to 3 children, they just end up having fewer for all these reasons. Even if we solved that today.
By the way, one of the things that the demographers discovered is that women are not having fewer children. Really what's occurring is that more women are not having children at all. So once you have a child, the average number of children per woman is actually the same as it's always been in the last 100 years. It's not really changed that much. But what we have is an explosion of what's called unplanned childlessness. And this is women who always intended to have a child, but discovered, because they waited so long and then couldn't find a mate and the fertility decreased, that they were unable to have a child. And that's what's exploding in all these countries is an epidemic of unplanned childlessness.
We're still talking about a considerable lag in the demographic problem. We're still going to have an aging society. We've still got 20 years before any new babies come through into the workforce. But that just adds to the urgency to me. We have got to start talking about solutions. Otherwise, we are going to be no better off in 2050.
Well, on that, and just trying to pick up on that, this whole question then of solutions now we have been through a number of decades now, pronatal experimentation in Asia, in Europe. I mean, I remember editing with Brad.
Yeah. Pronatal is like, pro-baby. Antinatal is anti-baby or anti-having children. And then he's going to talk about some work he did with Brad Wilcox.
The book on the causes and consequences of low fertility in 2015. And the kind of view then was that all these policies hadn't really worked. It's hard to find a consistent set, particularly the child benefit type incentivization. Doesn't really see, the most you seem to be able to get is maybe a couple of points on the birth rate is about it. Any thoughts on the difficulty of reversing fertility decline? Has any country done it? What are your thoughts? Well, I'd like to say a few things, but I think Philip perhaps knows more about this than me because he spent more time in Hungary than I have. Which Hungary is the country that's tried hardest. In my book, Procreate or Perish, I conclude with a section called Solutions. And the first thing is, what can technology do for us? And I more or less conclude as we have not very much. You tell your mum, I got you the Turing, the version of the robot to look after you that passed the Turing test, and they're still not very happy. I'm skeptical about AI. I mean, it's wonderful in many ways. It's a challenge. We have all sorts of issues, but will it replace labor? I think in a very limited way. The next chapter is, what can government do for us? And the last chapter, what can we do for ourselves? So I think there is a limit to what government can do for us, although a certain amount of experimentation, a certain amount of change of policies. Again, I think Philip knows more about this than I do. But I do ultimately think that whatever government does, if you do not have a culture that is pronatal, how you create such a culture is another question. But if you go to Israel, the passion people have for their families, for their children, and the desire to have children, the normality of having children is why they have a fertility rate of 3. And if government is going to be doing this in isolation, if society, if culture doesn't change, then I think what government can do is quite limited.
Yeah, I mean,
So, Abraham to the rescue. This has been the drum I've been beating for now almost 20 years. Ever since I discovered it, being in Israel and just seeing. And so, what he said there is so key. He's like, when you go to Israel and you see the passion that fathers have for their families, that is what's different. And I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I was 23 years old, single. I had zero passion for, you know, having children. I was like, maybe someday, but it was just definitely not a passion. Felt like it might be a duty someday. And then I was surrounded by men in a Western sort of, or I would say more of an affluent society, a more developed country that were passionate for having children. And, I've spent my life trying to understand how that happened and adopting the kind of beliefs that create that kind of a mentality and that kind of a culture. And we can create that kind of a culture. It ought to be a normal part of Christian culture for us to think about Abraham's passion for building a multi-generational family team as just normative for what it means to be a Christian and follower of Christ. And we have somehow adopted the typical Western idea of family that is so antinatal. And whatever you think about children, whatever you say you think about children, it's not worth the sacrifice in this culture, according to the way that secular and also most Christian people think, to actually have a large number of children, to actually make the kinds of trade-offs that are required of having a large family. And so we don't have a normative culture of a love for children, a love for fatherhood, a love for motherhood. And that comes directly from understanding the model of Abraham's love for building a multi-generational family team. So I've been trying to figure out how to package this, how to give and introduce people in our culture in the West and within Christian cultures in particular to the belief systems that are right in our own Hebrew Bible, but that have been somehow totally ignored by Christians in the West. And I think that we are the salt and light of the world, according to Jesus. And I think we have not been salt in preserving a pro family culture. And it's not just in simple policies about whether or not you believe in abortion. It comes all the way down to, is it a passion of yours to raise a large multi-generational family team? Do you see that as a good that is worthy for every single mother and father to pursue? Are we training our children to think that way? And this is what you see in Israel, in so many of the, especially Orthodox Jewish families. They know how to do this, and we were friends with one Orthodox Jewish family in Israel that had 8 children, and all their kids were having kids, and their Shabbat dinners, and it was just like amazing. Kelsey got to live in their house for months. It's so valuable to be exposed to a culture like this. But one of the up till now, it's sort of been this almost academic or theological question. But these people are just demographers, and they're saying we're doomed if we don't figure this out. Like, there is no good way out of this. Technology is not going to come save us. Government is not going to come save us. We have to be rescued by creating a culture that loves children and loves families. And this is going to start when fathers understand the example and the values of Abraham. And those are thankfully being preserved by Jewish fathers. And if we don't get a hold of that, we're not properly influenced by that theology, then we're going to go right down the same place, the same dark road that so many of these other countries are already on their way down. So yeah, what does that turn up for you, Sid?
I guess I kind of have a question because one thing keeps on coming up with, like, in that interview with the Koreans and several other places where when asked, "Do you want to have kids? Like, how do you feel about having kids?" Then a lot of their answers are like, I'm not opposed to having children, but I'm not financially stable enough yet, or like I need to get all my money together and the current economy isn't really allowing for it. So, I guess I'm asking, was the chicken or the egg first? Like, is a thriving economy what's required for having big families, or do you think we can have big families without a thriving economy, or like which one do you think is required?
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, what's fascinating is that the poorer the country, the larger the families. I mean,
Mhm.
that's it. So it's the more affluence we get, the more we, and the real reason for that has to do with individualism, I think. So what happens in a wealthy economy is that you begin to atomize the family into its individual units, because you don't have a vision that's strong enough to keep the family working together as a cohesive team. And so you no longer need to have more children. It's no longer economically advantageous to have more children. You're not working on a farm or whatever. And so you are thinking about each child is thought about as an individual. The mother and father primarily doesn't see themselves through their family identity, but their individual identity. And so you have the money to do that. Now, in a poor country, you have to work together. You have to constantly look out for each other. You know, your survival is at stake if you start to atomize into individual identities. So there's all kinds of patterns within those cultures to stop the mother, the father, the children from doing that, particularly the children and the mother. I mean, fathers, you know, they can still often get away with trying to become individualistic and pursue some kind of selfish ends, and that's devastating to those families in those poorer countries. But this is why in poorer countries you have large families. And so that what's difficult and what needs to be studied, and this is why I'm adamant about this, is that what Abraham represents is a vision for family that stops the individual the individualism that is inevitable in when you become affluent. So what I saw in these Jewish families is even though they could afford to become hyper individualized, because their primary model for their identity as a father was Abraham, and Abraham, despite being a wealthy man, chose to continue to see himself primarily as Father Abraham, and was more interested in building up his multi generational family than he was in making money or inhabiting an individual identity. That this is the model for Jewish fathers. This actually inoculates them from becoming um, disinterested in large families when they become affluent. They continue to see themselves primarily as fathers and continue to see it as a advantageous thing to build a large family. And so part of that is there's really simple ways in Israel where people, as they actually experience what the goodness of life as the head of a large family clan, as a patriarch of a large family, through something like a Shabbat dinner. I mean, I think that Shabbat dinner is the gateway of complete cultural transformation from what these guys are talking about, a culture that essentially wants small families because we all primarily are living our lives out as individuals, you begin to see and experience the goodness that's described in Psalm 128 of a man at a table surrounded by his children and his wife within his home. Like that is the good life in Israel, and that is not the good life with Christians in the West. They don't experience the goodness of a multi generational table on a weekly basis. They experience it the same frequency as the culture experiences that, which is maybe twice a year on Thanksgiving and Christmas. That is not enough to create a culture that that is dedicated to building a multi generational family. So I think economics play a role, but one of the things that's amazing to me is that if you do start to adopt Abraham's vision of family and fatherhood and start to really value children and value multi-generational family, and of course Abraham only had two sons. You don't have to have a large family. He would have loved to have a large family. I mean, he did end up having more children after Sarah died, but he lived his life primarily in a very small family. But in that small family, he was constantly lifting up the values of family and multi-generational family. And God's promise to him was that, no, your descendants will be like the sand of the seashore, or the stars of the sky. And so that was what was really driving Abraham's family vision. So I think that wealth can actually make that a lot easier. I mean, it's a lot easier to have a large family if you do have the resources to have it. And I think that part of what we need to begin to think about is a lot of families are very affluent and have plenty of money to have a large family if they actually were multi-generational. The problem today is that you have this culture of you kicked out at 18, we hit the reset button. Good luck, son or daughter with your life. I made it, I somehow survived. You make it, you somehow survive. Give you any resources or anything that would help you get going in your life. That is just going to lead you to having an entitlement attitude towards life, and so you need to learn from the school of hard knocks the same way I did. Man, that is a terribly devastating way to think about building multi-generational families because it really requires in most times in history, and I think we're getting to another time where the economy is starting to suffer in a way where you're going to need your parents' help to do this early. If you don't do this early, you might not get to do it at all. And so I think that I would certainly tell a young family that doesn't have any family support, like, do it anyway. Have kids early and often, and really lower your lifestyle. And you're gonna have to be really creative and work through, a really tough, 5-10 year season potentially of near poverty to pull that off. But what you're actually providing for in the future is that you want to pay that forward. Make sure that you don't put your kids in that situation. Be raising your children to desire to have kids early and often, but then communicate to them that you're going to get the help of me and your mother or me and your father to make sure that you can thrive economically even in those really early years of having children. And this is the way that multi-generational families function in the Middle East. I mean, I every time we're in Israel, I take people, back past these Arab houses where a different generation lives on, each floor of the house. And so that's a design that's built to help children immediately have children because they have the help of potentially two upstream generations who oftentimes are living literally upstream in the house. And so you don't have to worry about housing, initially. You just worry about building your business and having children, and then you're getting the support of the family before you.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot more sense than the vision, the model that we have right now, because it's very unrealistic to for a man to, as soon as he becomes an adult and he still knows very little, as soon as he gets thrown into the world, as he needs to just make a lot of money, um, somehow figure it out. And especially in this economy, it's a lot harder. It's a lot less straightforward. You probably have to make something of your own in order to make any good money, which is very difficult at first. And you're going to be living in poverty for a while probably before it takes off. So yeah, that just seems like such a more natural progression, very non-individualistic. I don't think we were meant to have a fully individual success story, and we can see that it's not common. Like when people have those kinds of success stories, it's crazy, and it's like, how can we expect everyone to do that? And we wonder why the poverty gap is growing. So, um, yeah, it just makes so much more sense if you have been working for decades already to make a lot of money, who better to spend it on than the coming generations, who are going to precede you when you're gone. So it just seems like the best form of investment instead of just trying even more to make money for yourself when you're, in your 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So yeah, that just it makes a lot more sense, and it seems like it would just lead to a lot more cultural richness and family richness. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that, we talk about privilege in society, different kinds of privileges, and the kind of privilege that I want for every single family is generational privilege. No child should be born without being given generational privilege, and that is without having a mother or father, grandparents and great grandparents who have thought about them and that have really prepared the way for them to be successful in both their life, their spiritual life, but also their ability to continue the family line and expand the family line. If that was a passion of every parent and grandparent, then yeah, you would have so much continuity between the generations, and there would be just a lifestyle of that level of support. When Hillary Clinton wrote the book "It Takes a Village," one of the things that is true and untrue about that thesis is that it absolutely takes a lot more people than a nuclear family to raise a multi-generational family, having kids early and often. But the actual village that God provides for family is the extended family. If everyone is trying to build large families, then you're being raised in a whole society of grandparents, great grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. Like uh the world, the village that children are really built for. And I was having a call just before this with some of the guys in the Following Jesus Friday group, and we were having this conversation around, when you're bringing a child into the world, oftentimes, there is one was basically quoting a study that said that a child is basically designed to have lots of interactions very early in their, when they're 1, 2 years old, with lots and lots of different people, and that the book they were referencing is the perfect scenario for that is a large extended family around that child. And I was like, when I see Elijah, one of the things really unique about him is that because he's the first child that is being born into our family as we're pursuing a multi-generational vision. He is right now, we're, living in a house. We have 4 generations in the house that he's living in, right? So he's living here with his mom and dad, and then he's got his grandparents living here, me and your mom, and then he's got, aunts and uncles around him, all the aunts who live here. And my parents still live in our house, his great grandparents. And you can see that he knows each person, he has a relationship with each person. And I can't even imagine what that's like. I don't know what it's like to be Elijah. I don't know what would feel like to be to just from the time all the way back to when you can't even remember, when you're first being sort of socialized, you're surrounded by all these people, all these different generations, all these people who love you and want to hold you and talk to you. Man, that is such a different experience. And I think that's the way we were designed. I think we need to go back to what kind of world did God design us to live in? And it's not a world where we're being cared for by robots. I know that much. It's a world where we're being cared for by a large, loving, multi-generational family.
Yeah, and I just really with the economy and education emphasis, I really like to look at Korea as a case study because I'm just very interested in Korea in general. And it's crazy how much of a change has happened with their cultures because you love to talk about that guy that had like every descendant in his family memorized,
Yes.
every ancestor. And so somewhere along the line, I don't exactly know where, probably around the 80s and 90s, there was some kind of transition where the emphasis became so much more on education, especially when women were allowed to get educated. They even had to work even harder than the men to get a good education. And so, what happens when you put so much time and money into that pursuit? You go out on the other side and you're like, well, then now I need to make all that worth it. So, I need to enter the workforce and be good at it and make that my goal, my life goal to be really
Yes.
good at this thing and be really contributing to the economy and work hard. And that's where we're at right now. And it became super competitive, not for, it wasn't competitive in the way of capitalism, really. It was more competitive in the way of like who can get the best, most expensive education.
Yeah.
And nowadays there's a culture where people don't think they can raise kids well because raising kids well means providing for their super expensive education. And so they're saying like, oh, in order to send my kid to school, the tuition would be this much. And like that they're talking about a very prestigious academy. So they're like, I'd have to make this much money in order to send my kid there because the tuition's so expensive. And it's like they don't realize that that's not the most important thing. They care so much about competing with other families and other children, and like the way they compete is with whose education is better.
Right.
And then if you're investing all that education into a little girl, then she's not going to want to have kids because that's going to take her away from her whole life goal, the thing that she's been working for all of her life. And so you can see really where that makes a culture end up. Because before it used to be like the cream of the crop would get a good education and they might even have kids later, but they would pursue a career. Now it's like everyone has to do it if you want to be good at anything. So that's where it's ended up, and so they don't wanna have kids because it would totally ruin all that they've been working towards their whole life. And so that's really what happens. That's the whole culture thing that you're talking about. Their culture isn't one of wanting to bring up children and caring and being passionate about it. Is being passionate about spending a lot of money during education, working really hard, getting really good grades, making sure that you're better than everyone else, all of your peers, and then finally you will get a career and then maybe you'll make money. So it is
Yeah.
such a different culture, and it's one that does not have a long memory, and it's one that won't survive the test of time.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting to be contrasting these different cultures and see which one is gonna win out in 50 years.
Yes. Yeah. You can see where they're headed. That's why I find demographics so helpful. And that's a great point that I think that oftentimes people will always caveat any discussion about, having children or having a large family with, well, I understand that a lot of people don't want to have children or don't want to have a large family, and we should never try to force people to do something they don't want to do. And so what actually and that, every time they say that, I'm like, if you're going to caveat like that, at least admit that we have done exactly what you just described, Sydney. We've spent decades now telling women not to value these things. We've been telling them stories. We've been promoting like go to college, get a career, be a girl boss, do all these things. And so all the things that we've been telling women, like we're a part of the reason they don't want this. Like people's desires or values are not formed in a vacuum. They're formed primarily by the close relationships in their life, and secondly by the stories that they're being told. That's how values emerge. And so when you have all your close relationships telling you your value or your success in life is going to come from if you achieve college or what you achieve in your career, and here's a bunch of stories that show you that that's the valorous thing to do, they're going to then desire those things, right? Our individual desires are a very small part of that equation. The equation is primarily relationships and stories. And so that's why, like, if you create a family that where all the people are that are you're close in relationship with are promoting the value of fatherhood and motherhood, and you tell stories about fatherhood and motherhood from your family line, and then of course larger stories about other families, then they're going to start valuing those things. It's not rocket science. So I think we're just hiding where values come from, and then want to say, well, we want to honor all those individual values. I don't want people that don't want to have children either. But I also want to like actually understand, why don't they want to have children? Where did that come from? And there are people that I think that they may, for some individualistic reason that's very unique to them, not want to have children, and they should never be, forced to have children. 100% agree with that. And their decisions and their desires should be honored. But man, most people's desires in this area are coming directly from relationships and stories, and we as a culture need to take responsibility for that. All right, so I got one more thing before I let you go, and this is actually related, but I think a lot of people don't really maybe understand why. So one of the things that I want to talk about is the royal family valuable? And I think that there's good and bad reasons for, good reasons why you might say there it's not valuable, and good reasons to say that it is valuable. But I think one of the reasons that's maybe very underrated that I want to sort of promote a little bit, and that is that we need to have something to aim at as a family, and as families. And I think that the royal family provides a symbolic ideal. And I think that it's difficult because, the symbolism's obvious, the symbolism of the crown and the symbolism of the beautiful mansion and the symbolism, but they're symbolizing a thriving multi-generational family, and everything's turned up to a 10 in terms of the pageantry and all that stuff. And all those things are really designed to be symbolic. And what we've been obsessed with culturally is a kind of piercing the facade and doing what we do to all symbols, and that is trying to rip it down from the symbolic world into the real world and say, no, these people are just like everybody else, and they get divorced and they're miserable, and blah blah blah. And I think that we're not doing anybody a good a service by doing that. I'm not obsessed with the royal family in some kind of you know tabloid way. I'm just really interested in the conversation around the fact that I think that the actual Bible presents the ideal family like a monarch. I think that the whole point of the reason why Sarah's name was princess, for example, in the Bible, or when God first made the first family and said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill, subdue, and rule." The ruling of the family line was actually a part of the design of family, and that is that through generations, you begin to move towards this world. It doesn't mean you're going to be a monarch, but it does mean that you're going to be a ruling household, and that this is actually it's useful to have symbolic depictions of ruling households, like in monarchies, constitutional monarchies, like the UK. So I want to play this and see how he defends the idea of a monarchy.
Why does a royal family matter? Why is it so important to this country, David?
It is the one continuous thread in our history. I try to explain to people why. There are several ways in which you can understand it, but essentially, and it is this utter paradox of it's English history. It's not British history. It's English history. It's this utter paradox of English history that all the things that we think of as our freedoms, the security of property, the forms of representative government, the rigorous enforcement of law, all happen under monarchy, are finally a creation of it, and it is their guarantor. In other words, we are that most paradoxical of things. We are a royal republic. As, in fact, King Charles very clearly understood in what I thought was a remarkably good speech, which he gave, the sort of invented, like so much of the accession, the invented speech when he met both Houses of Parliament in Westminster Hall and emphasized the fact we are a parliamentary monarchy. Now, many people think that that's a sort of creation of democracy in the 20th century. It's not. It goes back to the very latest, the beginning of the 14th century. In 1308, in a ritual that will shortly be reenacted, that's the coronation and the taking of the coronation oath. In 1308, Edward II was forced to swear an oath that he would obey and enforce the laws that should be chosen by my people. Shall be chosen. It is unique in the history of the English monarchy. In other words, what I think is important about the monarchy is that it shows that freedom can be historically rooted, that it's part of a tradition, that it is not a product of the 19th century, that it is not a product of democracy, that it is not a product of revolution, that it's not a product of a Bill of Rights, although all of those things at certain points enter into the story. The thing that finally guarantees freedom in Britain, extraordinarily, isn't the revolution of the 17th century, it is the restoration of a monarchy. And this is the wonderful paradox of English history.
Do you think that...
Now, in other words, I'm saying our history is the monarchy. That's why I wrote a book called Crown and Country, which is a history of England through the monarchy. It is the institution which reflects us to ourselves. Now, what the relationship of that is to Charles and Harry and the soap opera of all of that is anybody's guess. But I'm giving you the high intellectual view of monarchy.
Yes.
And I think it's one that is, I'm being desperately serious about it. Because remember, particularly this whole new labourish, new leftish university college constitution unit view of political freedom and whatever, that it's all to do with the Enlightenment, that it's all to do with written constitutions, that it's all to do with bills of right and sort of doing what more or less a newly enfranchised Eastern European country would set up as its structure of government. I will always gently try to remind people that the average age of a written constitution is about 10 years. They last no longer. The fact that, for example, America was able to create a constitution which has endured is utterly unique. There is no other example that compares with that. And of course, it has an enormous downside, as we can actually see at the moment. You cement a rigidity, you get, over the right to bear arms and whatever, you get.
Yeah, we like that. Okay, so this is interesting. So articulation of that, the idea of rights, we think about monarchy as almost a threat to rights. And I think there's two reasons why I'm always very interested in discussions about monarchical government at the philosophical level. One is because of the creation of a symbolic ideal for multi-generational family life. The second is because we believe in a kingdom as Christians, and we are looking forward to a future monarchy that we actually are currently serving. And what it means to be a Christian is actually to believe that the kingdom of God is here and that we are in a monarchy now, and that what is occurring on the earth is that people are in rebellion. And when Jesus said, "All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me," he was saying that I reign right now through my death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. I have taken over the kingdoms of the world, and I am the king. And we look forward to his return. So that's the idea that we believe. And I think sometimes when Americans in particular become obsessed with democracy, we can lose sight of the value of monarchy. And I think that, Winston Churchill, who said about democracy, it's, the worst form of government with the exception of all the other forms of government. I think that it's important to say that the best form of government is a monarchy with a perfect monarch, right? And that's what the Bible is describing. And so because we don't have a perfect monarch, we think, well, democracy is better. We can, vote somebody in or out. And we're just seeing a lot of things fray around the edges of our democracy. And I think that in a world or in a time period where politics are so polarized, where there is no multi-generational tradition, where we kind of imagine that our rights come from the government, which is a huge mistake philosophically. That in this context, I think that it's important to sort of take a step back, and this is sort of what I've done, and just really contemplate monarchy and contemplate the positive nature of monarchy. And I don't think we're going to ever have a monarchy in the United States. I'm not advocating for that, but I think that because there are some preserved monarchies, like the one in the UK, that is accountable to a parliament. I think that it's valuable for us to consider that as we look forward to the king's return. And so I'm constantly like thinking about this, and I find like as we're getting closer to an even more contentious political season, contemplating monarchy for me gives me a lot of peace of mind. And I've spent a lot of time watching videos about monarchy and trying to understand the philosophical foundation of the ideas. And I love how David Starkey really tries to work that out, at least in the context of the tradition of the United Kingdom. So yeah, I'm curious if there's anything in that stirs up, in your mind.
Like what you hear? Be sure to leave a rating and review for this podcast wherever you use streaming.
Yeah, it's just really reminding me of the same dynamic of having a man be the head of the household. Because the way that people react to that idea is similar to how people react to the idea of a monarch. And it can kind of be confused with dictatorship, where it's like, well, if we have one person in charge, then he's going to mistreat everyone. Um, and that has been true throughout so much of our historical monarchs. So I can see why people think that, just the same way as there's been a lot of abusive households where the husband is very domineering and very much like a dictator. Um, but that doesn't mean that the ideal is different, because that is the best way to have the hierarchy of the household. Um, doesn't mean that there aren't really bad husbands that totally drop the ball in that way and mistreat everyone in the household, but that is still the best way to do it. And that's probably the same way with monarchy. Like, the reason that we're not implementing it widespread right now is because there have been so many bad monarchs, and which, granted, very true. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad idea, and it's not a bad, especially symbolically, it's not a bad idea to have a ruling family and a man that has worked his entire life to learn to take this role. I think that part especially is very appealing to me. I read a lot of fantasy, and so there's a lot of monarchies in there. And whenever there's a good prince or king, they're always, that's always what they have been training for their entire life, is specifically how to be a good king. And they usually have a council. They usually have people keeping them in check. But they're very qualified for the job if they're good, because they've been trained at it. They've had the best trainers in the realm, helping them with this. And it's just, when there's nothing like a good king. It's just such an amazing it's such an amazing feeling to be able to trust in someone that has that much power. And I feel like that's not something that's very easy for something like a president or a prime minister. Um, there's really just nothing like a king,
Yeah.
a really good king. So
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, and I think this is part of the dynamic too, the two-party system where half the time people feel like they're disenfranchised until their guy gets elected. Whereas when a king exists in the culture, it gives at least the opportunity for the country to come together, and for that person not to sort of try to take a politically biased approach to governing, but really a unifying approach to governing, and it sort of calms down the political impulse. Because part of what's happening today is that the political is invading into more and more spaces, and I think that this is really causing huge problems. And I think that part of what you want to see, and I love your connection to the family because I think that you want to see just wise governing going on by somebody who loves the people, just like in a family, the father of a family who knows and loves his children, and it provides a huge realm of freedom for everyone in his family, and that he's not trying to be a dictator, but he is trying to take responsibility to govern wisely, to get involved when it's appropriate, but to not make everything about power and politics. And I think that so many people are making all of life about power and politics right now. And so that's where part of the reason why I'm like trying to investigate and understand, what is God's design. This is my obsession, obviously. Like I'm trying to understand what is God's design for government. And there's always been a sense in which God has promoted the idea of a multi-generational family line being a part of that picture. And so I think that it's fascinating to me that the UK has somehow been able to marry that system with something that's more representative, something that's more democratic, something that allows for change. And so it separates this sort of symbolic ruling from this parliamentary ruling. And I do feel like for those of us in America to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, to make sure that even though we'll never probably experience a monarchy in our context, to really investigate and think about what that means symbolically and what we're looking forward to. So this is a fun, just mental exercise for me and philosophical one to constantly think about. And you'll probably hear me bring it up more because I think that it can really root us properly to be thinking about the monarchy that ultimately we're going to be living under as followers of Jesus. So awesome. Well, Sid, thanks for joining me today on the tour around the things that I've been thinking about lately.
yeah, of course. Thank you.
All right, see you, babe.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.